Thank you for joining us. I am Clay T. White. We are hosting the We Need to Talk series to foster open dialogue and begin formulating solutions to address systemic racism and white supremacy. These much-needed discussions were the brainchild of Soo Kim Chung, Head of Public Services in UNLV's Special Collections and Archives, and was sponsored by the University Libraries and the Greenspun School of Urban Affairs. These panel discussions will provide historical context while addressing issues that are challenging us in the present day. Each conversation brings together UNLV researchers and community experts. We will formulate solutions for the long-term work we must do to heal the country and move us forward. This will take a commitment from all of us. These conversations will be difficult, but we must do the work. Truly, we need to talk. Tonight, we are talking about systemic racism as it manifests in the criminal justice system. My guests are Greg McCurdy, Frank Rudy Cooper, Dr. Tyler Perry. And during the question and answer period at the very end of tonight's show, please email your questions to university.libraries@unlv.edu. Today is October 1st, so it is a reminder of the healing power of Las Vegas. So we know that 3 years ago today, we had a tragedy in our city. So may this day of healing bring peace, resiliency, and hope to each of you, to our city, our nation, and our whole world. This panel, unlike others on the topic of policing, we want you as an audience to start living so that we can all enjoy this good life together. So tonight, we are going to we know that a few things need to be tweaked. So we're going to talk about policing in a different kind of way. Frank Rudy Cooper is the director of the program on race, gender, and policing at UNLV William S. Boyd Law School. Greg McCurdy is a security consultant and retired assistant sheriff at Las Vegas's Metro Police Department. Tyler Perry is an assistant professor of American Studies, African American Studies, and the African Diaspora Studies here at UNLV. So I'm going to begin just by telling you of a statistic that you should be aware of. The population of the United States is about 13% African American, but 40% of the prison system. So, Tyler, could you share what the current system of bail, the court system, inequities, re-entering society, what that does to the community, to families, unemployment, in the terms of trauma?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you wanted Tyler or myself.
I'm sorry, Tyler.
Yeah.
Sure, and feel free to chime in as well. Essentially, one thing that I've been thinking about quite often, and this is from Ta-Nehisi Coates' article on the impact of the black family and mass incarceration in the modern era, what we are seeing is the extreme stress and the proximity of the prison system within a number of communities and marginalized communities and children growing up being in close proximity to the prison system, despite the fact that they might not have ever been arrested themselves. What we are seeing is, as more and more, particularly black men, but a rising percentage of black women as well, are being funneled into the penitentiaries and prison systems, that has a deep impact upon how a number of young people are perceiving police, as well as the prison system as well, in that the police are a state enforcement arm that is incarcerating massive amounts of people disproportionate to the rate of the population. And essentially what this does is it has a negative consequence for generations of people who will grow up to see the police as an adversary. And we can't necessarily detach that from the history and the parameters of anti-blackness that were established before.
So, Frank, could you please talk about the imprisonment of black men, especially, you have a statement in your research that says, being imprisoned already. What is that about?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've spoken about is the fact that black men oftentimes feel like, because of the statistics of 40% already being in jail, that we are in fact always already imprisoned. And that's the sort of concern that I have, that it has become internalized, the statistic.
Okay. So Greg, how does all this happen? We talk about the Las Vegas black community, and I want you to talk about that a little. I want you to talk about the lack of employment here and how that system, person goes into prison, come out, there's still a lack of employment. How does that work?
You actually loaded me up with quite a bit there, Clayton.
Yes, that's right.
Couple things. So Las Vegas, you know, I remember growing up as a young child in the 60s, we had historic West Las Vegas. That's where the vast majority of black people lived, and that's where we went to school. And then along came sixth grade centers in the early 70s to try to integrate the schools by busing in other kids from other communities. Then we start being bussed out to the middle school. So as you look at Las Vegas and the evolution, and you look at the Las Vegas Strip and the evolution where, you know, a black person could, you know, be an entertainer there, but they couldn't sleep there, okay? So this is all during my lifetime. Yes. So, you know, to see that, and then I go to policing. So give a quick historical perspective. So when you look at the first, what we call career police officer that was black, started in 1946. That was Herman Moody. He spent 30 years, 31 actually. I remember he retired in 1977. And when you look at what he endured in policing early on in his career, it was the City of Las Vegas Police, so let me set the stage. It was the City of Las Vegas Police prior to 1973 and the Clark County Sheriff's Office. In 1973, it became the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. So to set the stage, the City of Las Vegas Police, they had the downtown area and they had the west side, historic west side. And in his case, he could only go work in the black neighborhoods. He couldn't work across the track, so to speak. He couldn't arrest white people. He wasn't even invited into the briefing room with the old city PD, and I did not find that out until much later, that he was not allowed into the briefing rooms. So when I look at where Metro was as a police department, the City of Las Vegas, Clark County Sheriff's, and where Metro is today, there's been a lot of improvements. Because I started in '83, and in '82, there was a lawsuit that had been filed by the Black Police Association that dealt with lack of promotion opportunities. The testing process disproportionately eliminated blacks and females. Transfers weren't done equitably. So a lot of things that they lost on, they had to make corrections. And 2 years after being on the department, I was asked to go, and I wasn't asked, I was told that I was going to be a recruiter to help try to diversify the police department. At least, you know, I was really making a valiant effort. The person I worked with and the people I worked with in the personnel office were. So I look at all of that. When you have a police department that does not reflect the community and doesn't have a good community understanding, and there's significant cultural differences, and then you take the fact that a lot of our officers come from other states, so not understanding the community and understanding people that are different than them anyway creates a bit of a divide, okay? And the goal at Metro was always to try to narrow that divide and try to make the police department and the community, instead of a them versus us, a more cohesive, collaborative, if you will. So I think Metro's done a good job. I think Metro has continued to work on it. There's some good news that's taken place with the reality-based police training. But at the end of the day, what we see in this country is very alarming. And I know we often say, well, how does the police derive their power? I'm going to answer that in a little while, because I think you received an email about a conversation I may have had with someone around 2004 when I was chief of investigations and I was chairman of our use of force board. So not to talk too much right now.
Okay.
I have a lot of information on that. It's going to be a one-sentence answer.
Okay, good. So Tyler, you had started talking about trauma. So can you now take us back into history and talk about that trauma and how the Black experience began and how does it play out today?
Sure. I mean, there is a deep history to what we would call law enforcement organizations. And so when people talk about the history of the police, it's actually hard to determine if there is a linear history of the police, simply because for a very long time in American history, states had significant power to self-govern. The federal apparatus was relatively weak. The executive branch and the presidency was not able to enforce a lot of laws in individual states, and that extends even into the British colonies. And so the first point of trauma, one could say, in the organization of a law enforcement policy is the development of slave patrols, which a number of people have ascribed to at least one origin point of what we would call a modern policing unit, because nothing like that had really existed. I mean, there were constabularies, there were night watches that existed in the colonial era, but nothing like an actual organized body of men who were, to talk about power, explicitly empowered to brutalize and harass and arrest and surveil people who were deemed deviant to the structure. And that language essentially was very blatantly used to talk about slave patrols, to patrol for enslaved people suspected of running away or being out after curfew. And so that begins in the very early 18th century within South Carolina, and quickly expands to pretty much any state that remained as a slave society after the American Revolution. So it's commonly associated with the South. And so if we're talking about the origins of police and slave patrols in the South, that's basically the Southern story as to how the first law enforcement agencies are formed. Whereas in the North, it's different, but not much better, in that the North still was very much predicated upon returning runaway slaves that tried to flee north, and so they certainly had bounty hunters that were empowered within their area, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act of the 1850s. But specific police forces in urban spaces within the North were strictly formed under the suspicion that immigrants were causing trouble or that they were taking too many jobs, and they were specifically empowered by those who owned the capital. And so it was very much the ruling class or the elites that were very much interested in forming official state police forces as an arm and an apparatus of the state to essentially arrest and detain people who were considered suspicious, and that was usually Catholics or ethnic groups like the Irish or Eastern Europeans. But to kind of contain the answer a little bit, to fast forward, if we talk about trauma and terror, one thing that's worth pointing out as far as the origins of police units or vigilante organizations that were empowered by the state, if you read the narratives of formerly enslaved people in the 1930s who recollect their experiences under slavery, they would often confuse the slave patrols with the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, sometimes they would make the mistake of saying the Ku Klux Klan used to arrest runaway slaves, whereas historically we know the Ku Klux Klan was something formed in Reconstruction. But for them, the Ku Klux Klan was so similar to the slave patrols that they actually confused the two and saw them as the same entity and the same body. So the comparisons between the way some law enforcement or police forces act and as compared to the Ku Klux Klan does have some historical resonance within the documents and the way people of African descent interpreted the trauma that was inflicted upon them from slave patrols to the Ku Klux Klan, and then after the Great Migration out of the South into cities throughout the North and the West, urban police forces that were invading their neighborhoods under the suspicion that they were committing a crime.
So now we're talking about urban police forces. So Greg, I want to go back to you. And I want to talk about that transition and talk about community policing. How did that come about? How does it work? And give you more to talk about the policies and practices and how it has changed over time here in Las Vegas.
Okay. You hit upon a lot of things again. I appreciate it. So one thing I think you've heard me say this in the past. I hate is a strong word. I don't like that community policing is seen as a program, first and foremost, because I don't think it should be seen as a program. It should be taught that we just treat people with respect. We go into neighborhoods, we need to work with the people to police their neighborhood because they know it best. If you create the right relationships, you will solve more crimes because people are going to be more apt to give you information. You can prevent crimes by being a collaborator with the community. It is no them versus us, and it should never have been, other than what Tyler's alluded to, slave patrols. That was to suppress and oppress. Well, when you move to urban policing, that's old. We have to look at it as an opportunity to keep our communities safe, to weed out those who are committing crimes, because no one wants that. The police is who stands between chaos and civility. Everyone just wants to live in civility and live in a nice neighborhood, apartment, or whatever the case may be, free of crime, and just being able to do what they do, okay? So when I look at policing, you know, we just need to do more of those things that create a good, wholesome environment. But if you will talk about programs, you know, it's interesting because I'm gonna talk about it in a succession way. In the old days, it started this program called line solution policing. So line solution policing was that there was a problem, you put the cops on the problem, and you know, this is after the broken windows theory, all right? So we're gonna get in a little police jargon for a little bit, okay? So you got the broken windows theory, and so if you leave one window broken, another one will become broken. So you wanna fix that broken window, and you don't want it to become broken again, so you have to work with the people to prevent that. So you got a line solution. Then you get the problem-oriented policing programs. Okay, again, it's not too dissimilar. It's pretty much the same. It's a problem, let's solve it, okay? And then say, oh, well, we can't solve it by the police alone. We were doing really unique things to try to do it. And the unintended consequence or intended consequence, who knows, is that you look at, I'll use the example of the crack cocaine problem. I'll use the example of maybe even marijuana. Disproportionate number of black folks were arrested for that, incarcerated. So when we start looking at that, where that 40% comes from, it starts there, and then then they might get out, and then because of a record, they can't get a job, then recidivism occurs. So, you know, it's such this cyclical is the better word, event of things that occurs that creates this real problem in our communities. And when you look at our communities where people want to look and say, well, where's the black man? Where's your father? Where's the, look, we can't even get out of prison. And then you fast forward to today, or even just 2 years ago when it really became an awareness to largely everyone, was I looked at the opioid addiction and what was going on with the opioid addiction. So, well, I guess we can't arrest our way out of that one, right? So now we provide Narcan, we provide all these things that police shouldn't be doing, in my opinion, instead of arresting like we did with marijuana, crack cocaine. So then you start to see, okay, well, certain communities of people are treated differently, and that's what's frustrating to people. And I get it, and I get the role that I played in the war on drugs. That's what we were directed to do, you know, and then you look back at it, and, you know, sometimes there were some very petty arrests, all right? And people end up in the system. And when you're in that system, it's hard to get out. It is hard to get out.
Yeah. So, Frank, you may chime in on anything you've heard so far, And then I want you to end by talking about, in your comments, by talking about cop fragility. And tell us about that.
Sure, absolutely. So people have heard of the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, and one of the things I did was look at her thesis and then see if it might apply to policing, especially in the way that Greg was just talking about. So the theory of white fragility, if you break it down, has two components. One is that there's a myth of an objective individual. And the myth of the objective individual would say that there is always an ability to be neutral and fair. But it's a myth, right? None of us can get outside of our experiences and our past history, our viewpoints, etc. And then the second aspect of it is bad intent theory. And bad intent theory says that if there is a source of discrimination, we won't believe that it was in fact bias unless there's proof that it was purposeful to discriminate against the person. So it's not enough that you should have known that this was going to cause harm to black people. It's not enough that you had a reckless disregard for causing harm to black people. Instead, it has to be that it was your goal to harm black people because they are black. Now, given that kind of bad intent theory, we start to see how this might play out when it comes to policing. So first, the objective individual. The police oftentimes will think that they're the only ones who can judge what are the appropriate strategies for different neighborhoods instead of working with the community, as Greg suggested. And then when it comes to bad intent theory, when we say, as critics of the police sometimes, well, you are harming the community, you're causing trauma in the community, as Tyler was talking about, then they will say, that's just a few bad apples, right? It's just a few bad apples. And the reason they can say it's just a few bad apples is because their theory is, if you can't prove that a police officer said, I'm gonna kill you because you're black, then it couldn't have involved bias. But we know there's implicit bias in everybody. The cop fragility part of that is when police officers won't acknowledge the extent of the problem that's out there, won't acknowledge the bias that we all have and that police have demonstrated in the past. They are fragile to criticism. That fragility makes it harder for us to change the situation.
Yes. So that few bad apples, and this is open to everyone. I was on a panel the other night and someone said, a few bad apples, that's the main problem. And they said, 99% or more of police are good police. I want to know, why can't they get rid of then that other 1%? What is the problem? If they can't police each other, so anybody.
Let me take a stab at it. Having done this job for the number of years I did and having served at executive levels for the number of years that I did, I saw a lot of great cops do a lot of great work at the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. And I had a chance to meet and work with police officers from other police departments around the country. So while they continue to do great work, that's great. But every now and then you get that complaint against someone where they just were excessive. And you investigate it. You do all these different things, and you're looking for suspension. And then you have the fight of the union. You have, different process issues, just like in anything in the judicial process. It could be, that the investigator or the decision maker on meeting after the discipline didn't dot an I across a T. So it becomes, again, that fight that we see that continues by just systematic issues that occur in holding people accountable in general. But in policing, it's heightened because you have strong police unions. How did police unions get their power, right? So you start looking at how they get their power. Don't you find it interesting when you're looking at political ads now and they say endorsed by the police?
Yes.
Okay? So that has value. That has lobbying power in state assemblies and in federal assemblies. So when you look at it, it's very difficult, and police departments, and I know Metro has been working very hard to deal with the accountability and transparency. And it's going to take time, but this national registry, might be a good thing, because now a police officer, who's committed heinous violations of policy, procedure, or excessive use of force in Las Vegas can't just go get a job somewhere else if this real, registry works the way it's intended to work. But again, there are human resource issues that come into play from, personnel departments and the way things run. So it's a difficult issue, but it's a real issue that needs a lot of work and has to be a lot of good people really working diligently to change that problem, because it is a problem.
Tyler, Frank, yes.
Well, I wonder if we could talk about the blue wall of silence, because
Yes,
yes, it's certainly true. I know that Las Vegas Metro, some of the administrators would like to have more power to be able to discipline police officers when they commit misconduct. But you have to get the evidence first. And if there is a blue wall of silence where police officers will not tell about the things that they've seen, it makes it harder to get any kind of discipline on that officer.
And I'll go in a slightly different direction, because there is this discussion about individuals versus the institution that they represent. And one thing that's very clear in American history is that the law as written at that time is viewed in the contemporary period as morally just, when in fact we know later on that it's not. Slavery was a legal institution. A slave patroller was empowered to capture a slave under the law. They were legally empowered to do so. The same thing with Jim Crow segregation. Officers were able to enforce redlining policies under fair housing, or before the Fair Housing Acts. And so the perception of, and Greg, please weigh in on this, but the perception of a good officer as one who enforces the law as written is not a guarantee that 30 years later a person will say, well, that was a good cop because they arrested somebody for a nonviolent marijuana crime, and takes them into the system, which, as mentioned, it hardens a person and changes them. And recidivism rates are very poor in the performance. So it's not a correctional facility. It is intended to punish people and to demoralize them. And so the argument that I typically make is, despite the best of intentions and the rhetoric that we have now, one could argue an entire generation, particularly of young black men, has been lost through the system because of unjust enforcement of criminal policies as written by people who wanted to control populations rather than actually uplift the community. And so it's good that we're having the conversation to now adjust the laws to make sure they are more just and legally enforced in more just ways, but we can't necessarily change the past, and we have to deal with the consequences of what it means to be a good cop in the contemporary moment and historical period that we're talking about.
So we've heard a term that has been bandied about recently called defunding the police. I'd like for each of you to talk about that. And I think that because the word itself, I think it has turned off so many people. So can you explain what that term is? Greg, I'm going to start with you.
Please.
Okay.
I think it's a really bad term. Mm-hmm. I think it wasn't well thought out when it started to be bantered around. Defunding the police, in the minds of a lot of people, it means let's get rid of the police. That's what people hear when they hear defund. That's what I hear when it's articulated by some people. By others, I get it. And what I get is that, what they're asking for, reallocation of funding that could go to programs that maybe the police should not be the ones who are out there enforcing, because some of the programs don't need enforcement, they need help. When you look at the mentally ill, when you go back to the recession that leading into 2006 and 7, and state governments were having to make these tough decisions to kind of cut funding in all these programs, that's when the police were left 365, 24/7 to pick up the void, right? And so we're now having cops dealing with people who are mentally ill, who are homeless, not because they chose to be homeless, because they fell on bad times. They lost their jobs and whatever happened. And I'll tell you this, people who become homeless can become mentally ill from depression and not having the necessities of health care and all these different things that go along with it. So when you look at that whole defunding thing, wrong word, not proper, because we need the police. I don't want to live in a society, especially today's society, where the possessing and carrying of firearms is so prevalent that, you know what, these police officers have a tougher job. And I tell them when I come into contact with them, or when I'm speaking to them at their academy, and I say, I appreciate you. Thanks for wanting to do it, because it's easy to walk away from it now because people don't seem to appreciate the police the way they need to, but then the police have to continue to earn it. And that's what I tell them. You got to be respectful. When the citizen comes into your presence, you should speak to that citizen. That citizen may be the same citizen that saves your bacon. So, there's work on both sides, but the defund. And I just wanted to say something else, and this is not to defend the police, but when I look at the incarceration issue, yes, we were a part of it. The district attorney was a part of it. The public defender was a part of it. Because when you start to look at, systemic racism, equities, inequities, and all that, representation, okay? People who don't have a lot of money don't have the best representation all the time. So subsequently, they end up in prison for something that someone else may get a citation or fine for. So, our system, the whole system, is just ripe for some change, ripe for how we look and treat people. Because, when I look at Frank, he used that word, implicit bias, so prevalent. Then we got explicit bias. So we have all these things that we know about that, people need to take a self-assessment, take a look in that mirror, and every cop should do that every morning, but every citizen should also do it. And we need to come together. We need to really come together, because we as people can do much better than what we're doing now.
Yeah.
Please.
I guess I would just add to that and say where I have some sympathy with the idea of defunding the police is, if you think about it, as Greg said, as a means of taking some of the money that now goes to police and putting it into other places that maybe are more deserving of it. And the reason they're more deserving of it is, as you say, if you've got people who are homeless, there should be experts, right? Social workers, not necessarily police officers working with them. If you've got people who have mental health issues, we want people who are expert in mental health dealing with them, and not make the police officer wear 3, 4, 5 different hats. And so defunding in maybe its best sense simply means moving some of that money to other services that got cut. And then instead of, we started trying to imprison our way out of these different social problems. It would be nice if we said, every time we add $1 to the police, we're going to add $1 to mental health or to homeless care, or to, housing, et cetera.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the overarching question is what type of society do we envision living in, and what is the best reflection of the type of society we want to create? And I think that there's a few things going on, because, as mentioned, defund is to some degree an undefined term that is used very prolifically, arguably more now than I've ever seen before. But it's really referring to 3 things interchangeably, but needs to be much more specifically defined. There's reform, defund, and abolish. That's typically the 3 terms that are used. On the one hand, reform is this idea that you take certain steps and measures, typically more funding is how it's always been explained, and you invest in training programs, or even like just revising certain aspects of policing as we understand it. And the assumption is that if you can reform certain behaviors that exist within the police units, then that would create a better, more just police unit and a better interaction with the community. On the opposite side is abolished, which is used by people who just believe that the system was not created to represent marginalized people, and that if that is the case, then that system just needs to be demolished and replaced with something else. The problem is that very few people have articulated a clear vision of what would replace the police. And so it's not to say that it's not possible, it's just that there is no idea yet as to what that society looks like. Most people use defund as kind of a middle point. So defund can mean completely abolish in the cases for some people, but I think most people, as it was already been articulated, it is kind of a redirection of funds to not necessarily add to the police fund, but kind of attached things to the apparatus of policing Like when you call 911, you should immediately have an option for a social worker or a mental health care expert. So whereas there shouldn't be a dozen different numbers for different units that can help you, 911 should be a unit that can address all needs in a professional manner instead of forcing police who are trained perhaps to detain criminals, sometimes violent criminals, who might be approaching that situation assuming that aggression might take place when that might not be necessary.
So I saw you pick up some literature there, Greg. What did you want to share with us?
So I was doing some studying over the last several months, and I picked up this Police Use of Force, an examination of modern policing practices. Now, this was done by the United States Commission on Civil Rights. This briefing report was transmitted November 15, 2018, but we've not heard much about it. And I was looking at it, and there are really a lot of things that addresses the use of force, the research behind it, the policies and the practices. But you have said something a couple of times in the past that are important to talk about, is training. So you just touched on a training issue. The call comes into the dispatcher. So when we want to look at how we retool policing, we call it reform. I'm going to call this part retooling, because retooling is now really changing some nuts and bolts, okay? So if we retrain our dispatchers on how to ask questions differently, and if we were to able to take some of that money and, build up our health, our social services, we'll just call it social services to deal with mental health and homelessness. And then you train the police officer, because he still may have to go, because if the person's violent, or whatever, off the medication, whatever the case is, still got to go. But now, can we go with a professional? And I'm telling you can, because it's being tried in other communities today. I read about it every morning on the Police Executive Research Forum, daily clips. And so it's being tried. So more communities need to look at those different models and try something new. Don't be averse to it. And I'm going to give the sheriff Lombardo credit, and Gillespie and Young. What they did that I really liked was they did involve different community members to be on their advisory committee, represent all the diverse community of interest in Las Vegas. And they even included people from Henderson, Mesquite, and Boulder City, because it is Clark County and the sheriff has the responsibilities elected by all the people. So when you listen to what some of the topics that have been discussed with them in the past, let's continue to execute on this training. This training has to change. And I know there's a certain number of weeks, there's certain criteria by state peace officers and standards training board that has to be met. But how do we take time, really look at some of the examination of these things that a lot of work's been done. We had the 21st century plan on policing that was done under the last administration. This one was, by the way, transmitted to the current administration. And if anyone wants to read it, it's just usccr.gov. And you can find it right there, and you can see where it was transmitted to. And then we start to ask what was done with it. Because that's the other thing. We, the people, have to hold people accountable for change as well. Now, there's ways to do that. We know how that is, okay? One is vote, okay? So I'm going to leave it for there. So there's one other document, and I'll wait till the question and answer period, because I think that person may call in.
Okay, good. I want to know, when we talk about training, how should history be used when you're training police officers? Should a historian be a part of that whole program that these police officers go through? Is that going to be the time when they're going to take a nap? How can we make that relevant?
Well, I would say that history is important to talk about things like implicit bias and the reasons why people in the community may not trust the police. Because I think right now we're at loggerheads, and police officers feel like, well, I'm a good cop and I'm being treated, just like all these other folks. I think that if police officers better understood and sort of internalized the history of the use of policing as social control, and therefore as sort of being oppressors of the community, that they might be able to understand better why community members are not as helpful as they could be for now, right? And then they can build on the future with, implicit bias training, with de-escalation training, et cetera.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, the awareness of the history, and speaking as an educator who sees the transformations of students who take my introductory classes as well as my upper level classes, it is actually somewhat shocking to me how little is known about the history of policing and even the history of slavery and Jim Crow itself. And it's not that people don't know that slavery exists, but it's kind of this abstract institution that people seem to prefer to leave within the dustbin of history. They don't want to talk about it. It makes people uncomfortable to do so. And I think being introduced to this idea of cop fragility, it might explain at least why there is a defensiveness or a defensive posture amongst officers during these moments when they are being overtly criticized, institutionally speaking, as to the disproportionate enforcement of laws against specific communities, particularly marginalized communities of color. But I think to that point, if police had an awareness of the history of the institution, its outgrowths, and the ways it has been used to enforce unjust policies in inequitable circumstances, and explaining the problems with mass incarceration, that it doesn't build a productive society. Locking a majority of people of a particular group up serves virtually no benefits to a society, except for maybe empowering an arm of the state. And I think if there's an awareness of this, it would at least remind people that when they're approaching a particular situation and they're encouraged to pay attention within that particular training process, it would yield some benefits, at least forcing people to reflect upon the circumstances before they assume the worst in a particular person.
So we're about to go to questions. I think we have about another minute. So in that last minute, no one wants to snitch. Police officers don't want to snitch on police officers. Community members don't want to snitch. So how are we going to change that? How are you going to have a police officer tell something on another police officer? How are you going to have a community member? You have community policing. How are you going to have that community member give you a story about their next door neighbor?
Well, I think on the police side of things, there's legislation in Colorado and that hopefully will come to Nevada, which says, okay, you have a responsibility to tell if there's been misconduct and violation of constitutional rights, and will protect you from retaliation, and will also hold you accountable if you don't talk.
Let me take that a step further, because it goes on in many states, the duty to intervene as well. So you need to step up right now in the moment, in addition to filing the right statement of fact. So it's important that we look at that. And then when you start to look at the community's got to feel confident that you, the police officer, is not going to go out and tell Johnny the bad guy that Miss Clay T was the one who said that you were the one who committed that crime. Because people have to live in the neighborhood. The police go home at night. And they should tell cops, don't call them out right there in front of everybody. Give them your number, say, call me, we can meet a mile down the road or somewhere where we're not just putting you out on Front Street so everybody knows it was you who gave us the information. Next thing you know, you come up with a dead or badly beaten witness / victim.
Exactly. So I want to see if we have any questions from our audience before I go on. It looks like we have a question. Thank you so much. Has it been difficult to discuss policing issues in today's current climate? How do you bridge that gap? And this is just to anyone on the panel who wants to talk about it.
I've had no difficulty discussing, because if we can make a difference with a citizen who's paying attention to this program, or we can make a difference with a police officer who's watching it and may have gained some historical perspective to understand why people feel the way they feel, this is worth every minute spent, because that's the idea. We know here we're not going to change the city. We're not going to change the world. We might be able to change someone's mind, have them look at things differently and say, hey, what can I do now? And if we can keep moving the needle forward that way, then that's better than sitting back on our hands and not saying anything when there are good opportunities for discussion and conversation.
And
Difficult?
I would say it is more difficult because people are at loggerheads, but it is also easier because a lot of people realize that there's a real problem out there after George Floyd. And so that opens the conversation. It's still a difficult conversation.
And I'd just add to that, there's different spaces under which we perceive conversations happening. So if, and this is a particular talking point of mine these days, but if you go to Twitter or social media and you try to have the conversation there, it does tend to break down. I mean, social media tends to allow for the polarization of people's raw emotions. So it's useful for getting maybe an unfiltered perspective from a particular person who feels more comfortable writing it in a short tweet than in saying it. But to that point, as a person who's on the side of, critiquing police forces, I've actually never had an issue talking to officers, either in these panels or with officers I know on Metro. And so it is difficult from the perspective of the wider society, but unless we are on the ground level having conversations, it's hard to imagine anything getting done except for just kind of flame throwing on the internet.
Okay. Our next question. We have students watching today. What is the message you want them to take away as they observe current events and are studying the intersections of these topics like law enforcement, sociology, history? So what do you want them to take away, the message you have for them?
I would say if you see something, do something. Right? Not not so much that you should tell on people, which, is complicated for the reasons we've said, but we really do have the power to change one mind at a time, to vote one vote at a time, and to make some difference. And that's what I hope students will take from this.
I like for them to really pay attention, be careful on the sources they choose to get information from, get information from varied sources. Don't just stick with something that you're comfortable with. Learn to be uncomfortable, because if we can learn to be uncomfortable and try to look at things from other perspectives and then try to find the fact, then I think we can start to have even better conversations. We can move our communities forward, and we might just end up with a student who may be watching who may want to be a police officer, because we're still going to need good police officers. And if your generation really want to do something important in communities, law enforcement, professor, lawyer, doctor, whatever the case is, just be the best, most honest, most ethical one of those that you can be.
I think mentioning history, the lessons that we learn is that change comes from people who otherwise may have had no reason to believe that change would ever happen in their lifetime. So one refrain I often see from younger people or students is that this is the worst thing they've ever seen and there's no way forward. But if Frederick Douglass would have thought that way, or if Harriet Tubman would have thought that way, and they wouldn't have advanced the cause against all odds, people who could have been captured at any moment and re-enslaved, if they would have stayed silent, it's hard to believe the abolitionist movement would have been as powerful as it was. And then even after slavery ends, Harriet Tubman was a suffragist. She believed that you had to keep advancing forward to create a better and more just society. Society as we currently live in is not perfect, perhaps it never will be, but it can be improved, and we have to believe that if we raise our voices and seek truth and seek justice, then we can create a better society for subsequent generations, even if we don't see it ourselves.
So Greg said something about sources. You should be careful with the sources you use. Well, each of these conversations have a list of sources by going to our website. So know that you can go to UNLV's website, Special Collections, and you can see a source list that we put together. Brittany Sterling put all of these together for us. And you can go to your public library, and they will have those sources as well. So the next question. How do we build relationships between police and the community?
We just need to get to know one another. Citizens can take advantage of some opportunities that are open in the non-COVID environment. In a non-COVID environment, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department has First Tuesday. If you go on the website, there's other engagement opportunities. But if you see a police officer in a donut shop, coffee shop, I would say donut shop, that's a bad joke, right? But coffee shop or wherever you run into a police officer, say hello to that police officer. And police officers who are listening, you need to have conversations with people, meaningful conversations, because you can learn from that as well. So when I look at the opportunities, there are a lot of opportunities. Police officers live in the community. They shop, they go to church. I just think people just need to just start having conversations, and through conversation, maybe can learn to appreciate someone else's journey.
Any other comments?
I'll touch on it really briefly, because it's something that Greg had mentioned earlier about communities and where officers come from. And so there's two things. I mean, obviously, more people of color should be hired upon police departments, but I often see that as assumed to be the end all of the discussion. But what I really think is even more specific is that officers, it would be a good idea if they came from the communities that they police, at least initially, because particularly if you talk about the NYPD or large departments like LAPD, there was this hazing period that seemed to happen, particularly in the 90s, where you would put the rookie in what were called the roughest areas. And so obviously that's going to set up a scenario where the police officer is going to distrust the community and vice versa. Whereas I could foresee an occurrence where a young Las Vegan passes the academy from Metro and is placed perhaps to patrol the neighborhood where they were from, where they're recognized, and where they understand how things happen, because that type of sociocultural specificity is important, I think, for a constructive relationship between officer and civilian.
And I would just add one thing, which is that there's a difficulty. And one of the difficulties is that right now, I don't feel like police officers in general are listening to the criticism, and they have to listen to the criticism. That's not to say the criticism doesn't sometimes come in a form that is inappropriate and not necessarily moving the ball forward, but police officers are right now, it seems to me, more of the problem with their refusal to listen to criticism than the other way around.
Would you feel that having a longer training process for police would decrease the amount of the use of force or misconduct, maybe requiring an associate's degree or a certain amount of credit hours?
So there's been a lot of studies on academics in policing, and Metro now to promote beyond the job of a patrol officer or corrections officer, you do have to have certain number of credits for each level. So the reason that is seen to be a good thing, and I would say I was a part of it, and when we put those milestones in which you had to reach certain levels, was it gave you the ability to one, when you're in an academic environment, traditionally, not online, what have you, but in the classroom, you're around a diverse group of people with diverse thoughts who has to express themselves. You gather information from others. Plus, your ability to write is enhanced. Your ability to do research is enhanced. Your ability to really comprehend and really get into really deep, I call it educational environments, makes for a better police officer in the sense that now you really study policing, you study the policies, and you don't have to major in criminal justice. That wasn't the requirement. So all those aspects of educational opportunity makes a well-rounded person. When I look at, just kind of part of the point that I think I hear you saying, Frank, it's not as attractive to want to be a police officer right now. And that's a concern. You know, on the same token, it's not attractive to be a police chief right now, because some of the best police chiefs in America, some of the most, what I would call important reformers that there are in policing, are resigning. They've had enough. So what is that going to leave us in charge of police departments? So I don't want to start naming names, but you do the research and you'll see there's a lot of great ones that we're losing. So we are at a very, very difficult crossroads when we need more people of color to be police officers. Yet it's not attractive to be a police officer. It's certainly not acceptable in certain neighborhoods. Then even good people who were, white, none, black or brown, they don't want to do it. So we really have to do as much as we can in our communities across the country to help restore the image of policing, to help make people believe that it's an honorable profession, but the people who make that happen are the police who do the job. So that's their role and responsibility. They really have to change that perception. And then we can recruit good cops, educated cops, cops from, all different types of backgrounds, because that's what we need.
Any other comments on that one?
I'll just add very quickly in that if you compare police to other professions, because being a police officer is a profession, it's professionalization. If you are a registered nurse, you go to school for 4 years to save lives and preserve lives. Now, if a police officer is armed under the authority of the state to possibly take a life or to handle weapons that can take lives, that does necessitate at least a conversation about far more years of training that would be necessary in order to do that job appropriately, or at least within the eyes of the community. Most professions do require some type of degree or some type of elongated training. And there are other countries, though it's always hard to compare to the United States to other areas, but I believe it's at least a couple of Nordic countries that have a 2-year academy for police officers, because they view that as a very serious contribution to society, and they want to ensure that the person is mentally prepared over a 2-year period in studying the apparatus of the police force before they go out and interact with citizens of the country.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you so much. This has been such an invigorating, inspiring conversation. So I want to thank you for joining tonight, for helping us move forward and to heal. I want to thank our panelists, Ruby Cooper, Greg McCurdy, Dr. Tyler Perry, our donors, Sarah Mason, Jerry Tomich, and the UNLV Libraries, the Greenspun College of Urban Affairs, for sponsoring We Need to Talk. We'll be back for our next panel to discuss the media and media landscape and reporting responsibly on race. That's going to be on October 14th. So I'll look forward to seeing you then. Good night.